the statement still rings true in Martin Luther King's day that Sunday morning hour is still the most segregated hour. And the sad thing is that it's a picture of the reality of where we are as individuals in America. You see, the thing that as we talk about this beauty that urbanization has bring, the opposite side is the complexity of the matter, because the complexity of the matter is just that. There is no one way to solve this issue, to solve this problem. And I know that all of us think that we have the way, but really we don't. And so this is why I think many of us, especially as pastors, preachers, evangelists, we always just kind of throw it up and says we just need to be gospel-centered. Because it's a lot easier for me to say we need to be gospel-centered than actually to talk about the application of the gospel in this. Does Jesus really have something to say in the midst of all of what's going on in our society, or is he silent? Or is he silent? You see, we really believe that he is not. And what we want to do is look at Matthew chapter 7, verses 12 through 14, and look at the first section and specifically talk about how we are to rep Christ. And what I've entitled this sermon was simply the golden rule. The golden rule, but it's how to rep Christ well. Rep Christ well. And I usually don't do it, but it's an acronym, so bear with me. The idea of it's an acronym of REP, because basically I really believe that the sermon on the golden rule tells us that we need to rep. Ultimately, the R stands for first need to reflect. The E, that we need to be empathetic. And then the P, we need to have a proper perspective. So we need to reflect personally. We need to be empathetic corporately. And then finally, we need to put on the mind or the perspective of Christ. Matthew chapter 7, verses 12 through 14 says this. It says, "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life. And those who find it are few." You see, the golden rule gives us these three principles that we are to grab onto for us to represent Christ well. You see, the first point that I want to bring out is this idea of the golden rule challenges us to reflect personally. The golden rule challenges us to reflect personally. We pick back up in verse 12a where it says, "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them." You see, so early on, right here, we see in the text that Jesus is giving this group a principle. You see, this principle is not exclusive to Christianity. If you look at the golden rule, that you'll see that there's many different other literatures, there's many different other religions that has this baseline. So what Jesus is doing, he's taking a baseline core thing, a principle that should be applied in all of humanity. That if we all recognize that we are image bearers of God, that there's a certain level of dignity that we should both expect to give and to receive. And the principle is that you should treat others in the way you want to be treated. You see, you got to understand that inherent in the very essence of how Jesus is calling us to treat others is that he's saying to us that you got to first have an intimate understanding of how you want to be treated. You see, and I think that there's an understanding that we got to understand about ourselves before we can properly administer judgment. You see, right here, that some of you, in some of your translations, the word starts off with actually therefore. You see, the therefore is there because that it is basically a term of conclusion. So what Jesus is doing right here is that I believe that he's doing two things. First, he's going back to, he's saying, listen, you guys remember what we was talking about in chapter 7, verses 1 and following? He says, remember this idea of judging before you take the log or the speck out of your brother's eyes, take the log out of your own? And he's telling them to reflect on your own life before you begin to cast out judgment. So one, he's continuing on and saying this principle of the golden rule calls you to personally reflect before administering judgment. Personally reflect. But you see, the greater whole that what he's concluding and what many scholars and believe is that he's summarizing it as we're kind of on our descent to looking at what the purpose or the intent of the Sermon on the Mount. What's the whole of it? And so he brings us to this link that as he concludes in the final verses, giving us the larger purpose of the Sermon on the Mount. And see, and the golden rule calls us to reflect personally before we cast any judgment. You see, you got to understand that he tells us to first look at our lives because the golden rule is quantitative, not qualitative. It's qualitative and not quantitative. See, what I mean by that is that he's not just talking about how many or even the who you are to treat, but he's the more of the how you are to treat people. You treat people with the same dignity, the same respect, the same love, the same reverence that you desire to be treated. And there's a qualitative thing that he's calling us to treat other individuals. And so there's a quality that we have. The golden rule calls us to reflect on our desire to be treated well in order that we understand that people have dignity, that people have worth.